Genealogy has always been fascinating to me. I'm fortunate to have a distant cousin who's done a lot of genealogical research, and we found that our ancestors go back in western Pennsylvania to 1722. But there's another branch of the family that came over in the 1800s from Bristol, England. And Bristol is a seaport town, and they had a shop there on the quayside by the water where they were selling nautical instruments. I got to go to Bristol looking at some of the historical sites of John Wesley on a tour a couple of years ago, and I got to see the place where their shop was. Of course, all the buildings have changed, but there was something about standing on the side of that water, looking at it, and just thinking about all that had changed over the last few hundred years, and yet still some of the constancies of the human condition and human nature. Wondering some about what my ancestors would have been like. I like to think they were probably funny and adventurous, fun-loving people. A lot of the people on that side of the family are. I'm sure there were some of them that were mean and surly as well, but I kind of ignore those. Since it's my imagination, I can just focus on the ones that are the type of people I would have liked to hang out with, right? Now, there's something about that thinking back about the generations that is really powerful. Because whether we think about it or not, whether we know it or not, their choices affected us. Maybe you know your ancestors way back generations, or maybe you don't know any of your ancestors because you were adopted. But either way, the choices that our ancestors made affect how we live our lives today. They affect how we see the world, the opportunities that we've been given, and the ways that we were raised. Our roots matter. Today we're celebrating 200 years of the roots of Cabot Church. And of course, our roots of faith go back millennia before that. But we have an opportunity as a church to celebrate God's faithfulness over these last 2 centuries. We're blessed to do that this weekend with our community as well. On Saturday of this weekend, September 16th, we had a community fest where we invited the whole neighborhood, and we had people from all over the region coming and celebrating together with all sorts of games and bounce house and a car show, food, and a great time together. We had a lot of people that had never set foot on our property before, or at least not since it's been a church. Some of them were here when it was a school back in the day. But it was a great opportunity for us to connect with our community. And so we've been celebrating our past and looking towards our future. One of the cool things about trees is the rings that you see when you cut one down and slice it open. And of course, they say you can count the rings in order to tell how old a tree is, because roughly they add 1 new ring each year. But each ring tells more of a story than just the number of years. They can measure the amount of rainfall that was available to the tree, what the average temperature was. And because the trees in the area are experiencing the same growing conditions, we'll see that trees, even if one of them is only 3 years old and the other is 30 years old, the ring for a certain year will be roughly the same diameter, at least in relative terms, because they had the same conditions. And so they had a good growing year, or the conditions were rough, and so they only grew a little bit. The tree trunk tells the story of the trees maturing. When we hear people tell their stories, often that's what we're doing. We're seeing the growth rings revealed. Our whole church is enriched by stories of faith, especially of the older adults in our midst. And we get to learn from each other's growing over the different seasons. We can count the rings of God's faithfulness. Now, maybe you've got one of those family members who likes to tell stories, but they tell the same story every time you see them, or every time a certain topic comes up, and you hear the story again, and after a while you're like, yep, Oh yeah, I know that's true, isn't it? You know where the story's going. You know how it's going up. You're kind of trying to hurry them along on that, or I don't know. Maybe you are the family member who just tells the same stories all the time. My grandmother used to do this some, not to the point where it was constant or it was over the top, but certainly to the extent that I knew where the stories were going because I had heard them relatively recently, and I'd do the head nod thing and kind of try and hurry her along because I'd heard it before, but now that she's gone, it's hard for me to remember those stories. I mean, maybe I kind of know the gist of them, but I can't remember the details. And they don't come to mind nearly as often as I would like. And I wish that I had recorded her telling some of those stories that I heard so often. One thing that God tells his people over and over is to remember. Remember our stories. Remember what God has done for us. Because he says this because he knows how easy it is for us to forget. We lose focus on what's important or the path that we've been on. We get our vision clouded by the things that are right in front of us, or the things that are urgent, the things that are causing stress, or our busyness. Maybe we get clouded by our discouragement, or even positive things like that we're throwing our focus into that we want to. We can lose the stories of our past. But God reminds us to remember where we've been. In giving the 10 Commandments, the fourth commandment that he gives is for us to keep the Sabbath. And he gives his reasoning for this in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15. He says, "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." Remember that you were slaves, but remember that I didn't leave you there. He says this throughout the Old Testament. We see it in the words of the prophets, calling the people to remember God's faithfulness. We see it in the words of the psalmist, who are writing about the praise of God keeping his covenants and his promises. We see this in the New Testament as the gospel writers and Paul in his letters talk about remembering God keeping his covenant. Often it's framed in that. We say, remember that God keeps his covenant. Or it'll talk about God remembering his covenants, the promises that he has made to his people over the generations. God is faithful. And so we get to remember God's faithfulness as a church. We get to remember the history of this church. We started off as a class meeting, basically a small group that was gathering in the historic Cooper cabin, that today is a historic landmark that you can take tours of what life was like back in those days. 1823 was frontier times. So people were settling here and making land claims. And the next year, we began regular worship services as a church. But this was a preaching post in the area. You see, the way the Methodist movement grew in North America over this time was through circuits. There would be circuit riders who would go from one area to another. They would have maybe 10 or 15 churches in a region that they would be responsible for caring for and helping to grow spiritually. And so they would go to maybe 2 or 3 of them on a given week, a given Sunday, and preach in those 3 places. And then the next weekend they would go to a different 3 or 4, and then to another one. And they would make a circuit. And over the course of a month or 6 weeks, they would visit each of those churches one time. They would ride that circuit, and they would help grow people in their faith. And this was the atmosphere that our church began in. Then as the church grew, they built their own building and called it Knox Chapel. And then it became Cabot Church. As a church, we started in the Methodist Episcopal denomination. And then there was a merger in 1939, and we became the Methodist Church. And then in 1968, there was another merger, and we became Cabot United Methodist Church. And then this year in 2023, we joined the Global Methodist Church. So we've seen different denominations as a church. We started in that location in Cooper's Cabin, and then we moved to the building that's at the corner of 356 and Winfield Road. When I moved here, it was the Olympus Salon. That's closed now. But that building was the original Knox Chapel. And then in 1894, we moved down into the valley in Cabot itself, that classical church building that we had for some more than 100 years there. And then in 2002, we moved up to the Winfield Elementary School. And here we're worshiping today. And now we have a new sanctuary there. We worshiped this weekend outside. But there's been change over the years in the location that we worshiped. And then I was able to count 56 different pastors that have served at Cabot Church. 56. And we've had a number of different alignments as well, from being a part of a circuit to being a part of a charge. Often we were paired with Emory Chapel nearby, sometimes with some other churches. And then we became a solo, a pastoral appointment as well. But through all of these 200 years, we see that one thing that's constant is change. But it's always been with a goal. That one goal of making disciples of Jesus Christ. Because we remember what he has done for us. We remember his life, his death, his resurrection, and his victory over death and sin. And the ways that he offers us forgiveness. And we have this message. We have this message to be able to proclaim to the world. God has been with us. God is faithful. He is going to continue to be faithful to us as we move into the future. This weekend is an opportunity for us to count the rings of God's faithfulness as we see the ways that he has matured us as individuals and as a church for his glory. Let's pray. God, thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for your followers who started this church, who are willing to sacrifice to make it happen, and then who built buildings over the years and who taught Sunday school classes and taught our children and our youth, who preached, who helped one another grow in small groups. Lord, thank you for all of the servants who have gone before us. Thank you for those who have given so much financially, given so much of their time and their abilities over the years to see your kingdom grow. And thank you that we stand in this lineage, that we have the chance to be a part of something that is so much bigger than ourselves and that will continue into your future. Help us to live in response to your faithfulness, to live with joy, with gratitude, with service, and with surrender. We ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen.